Well, first, thank you for the kind introduction, Vice President Davis. And I think my remarks will have some thematic similarities to some of the remarks from Director Barr, among some of the other speakers. First, good afternoon to my counterparts from the Government of Israel, distinguished colleagues, and to all the guests gathered today at the conference. It's an honor to represent the FBI at such an event and to have the opportunity to address all of you today on a date that carries such significance for me, my fellow Americans, and the rest of the world. 21 years ago, the United States suffered an unprecedented terrorist attack on our soil that left an indelible mark on our people, our policies, and our patriotism. The terrorism certainly wasn't new on the world stage at that time. The events of September 11th changed the world and compelled my country to reinforce our partnerships with many others who know too well the horrors of terrorism firsthand. In the years since, many like-minded nations have sacrificed blood and treasure to pursue an often faceless enemy bent on threatening the lives of our citizens and that of our very democracies. As a senior counterterrorism professional in the FBI, I can assure you that America remains committed to the protection of people all over the world from the ever-evolving, multifaceted threat of terrorism. In fact, protecting the American people from terrorism, both international and domestic, remains the FBI's #1 priority, despite a rising need for us to be vigilant against cyber attacks, counterintelligence threats such as economic espionage, and increasing rates of violent crime within our own borders. Indeed, the threat from terrorism is as persistent and complex as ever. Perhaps for the first time, the FBI's counterterrorism operational tempo has remained simultaneously high on all three fronts: international terrorism, domestic terrorism, and state-sponsored terrorism. Over the past several years, the FBI has worked very hard to combat the increasing threat posed by domestic violent extremists, or DVEs as we say, those people who may be motivated to commit violence and other criminal acts to further social or ideological goals stemming from their domestic influences. The FBI's dual mission to protect the American people and to uphold the rights promised to every American by our Constitution requires a high threshold be met in order to investigate hateful or angry rhetoric. The FBI investigates when activity, whether it's online or elsewhere, crosses a line from constitutionally protected speech or assembly to criminal activity, such as threats, violence, and conspiracy. We cannot and do not investigate ideology, but when angry rhetoric moves to actually committing a crime, we have the authority and duty to protect our communities. The events of January 6, 2021 were absolutely unacceptable. People lost their lives, countless others were assaulted or were in fear of their life, property was destroyed, and a symbol of our democracy was under siege. In response, the FBI has committed significant resources to identify those involved in the breach and to hold accountable those responsible for the acts of that day. To date, we have arrested more than 870 individuals with crimes related to the siege, and we won't stop there. To adapt to a constantly evolving and persistent domestic threat landscape, in the last couple of years, we elevated 2 categories of this type of activity to our top threat priorities: racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists and anti-government or anti-authority violent extremists, which includes violent militias and anarchists. By raising these 2 threat categories, the FBI put them on the same level of concern as ISIS and homegrown violent extremists. Simultaneous to our focus on domestic terrorism, the FBI remains very concerned about the threats posed to the homeland and abroad by foreign terrorist organizations. ISIS continues to pose a threat to U.S. interests through the group's ability to direct, enable, and inspire attacks. We remain focused on investigating and holding accountable individuals who may have committed federal crimes or continue to present threats to our national security on behalf of ISIS, including members of the so-called Beatles, who participated in hostage-taking that resulted in the deaths of 4 citizens of the United States, as well as the deaths of British and Japanese nationals in Syria. 2 of the Beatles were recently brought to the United States to face justice and will be spending the rest of their lives in prison. Likewise, Al-Qaeda and its global affiliates remain committed to attacking U.S. and Western interests domestically and abroad, as demonstrated by their regular media releases calling for lone actor attacks in the West and continued al-Shabaab attacks on Western interests in Kenya and Somalia. They too remain poised to inspire individuals all over the globe to take violent actions through the prolific propaganda magazines printed in dozens of languages that provide operational guidance, tactics, and techniques for conducting such lone offender attacks against soft targets. Undoubtedly, U.S. government intelligence collection against international terrorism threats from Al-Qaeda and ISIS will be further strained without the presence of U.S. and coalition militaries on the ground and in the air above Afghanistan. This loss of collection challenges our ability to detect operational plotting against the West. That's why we're working with our partners within the U.S. government and internationally more than ever before, so we can get the best intelligence possible on what is happening. Though the U.S. recently conducted a tremendous intelligence operation against Ayman al-Zawahiri, we haven't lost sight of the fact, and no one should lose sight of the fact, that he was killed in Kabul. That he was found in Afghanistan reinforces the concern about the ability of our enemies, foreign terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda, to continue to reconstitute there and find safe haven. Finally, I'd be remiss not to acknowledge here the third category of terror threat facing not only the U.S., but the West more broadly, and that is from state-sponsored terrorists. A prime example is the Iranian regime, who've shown themselves to be increasingly brazen in their plotting against Western interests and Western-aligned Iranian citizens located abroad. Just 1 month ago, the U.S. Department of Justice federally charged Iranian national and IRGC member Shahram Persafi with a murder-for-hire conspiracy in support of the terrorist group. The plot involved arranging for the murder of one of our former national security advisors on U.S. soil, as well as that of another high-ranking civilian government official, all in retaliation for the death of IRGC Quds Force Qasem Soleimani. This wasn't the first time we have uncovered Iranian plots to exact revenge against individuals on U.S. soil. Indeed, Iran has a long history of plotting to assassinate individuals in the U.S. But the U.S. government and our partners like Israel have a longer history of holding accountable those who threaten the safety and security of our citizens. We will work relentlessly with our partners at home and around the world to thwart any efforts by the regime or any hostile government seeking to harm or kill U.S. persons and bring those responsible to justice. As you have heard, the FBI and the U.S. government writ large continue to have our work cut out for us in countering the pervasive threat from terrorism on all 3 fronts. At this time, the greatest threat we face in the United States is from the lone actor or small cells of individuals who typically radicalize online and who primarily use easily accessible weapons to attack soft targets. We see the lone offenders with both DVEs and with HVEs, who are inspired by the ideology of foreign terrorists. Lone actors present a particular challenge to law enforcement intelligence. These actors are difficult to identify, investigate, and disrupt before they take violent action, especially when their radicalization and most of their communications with other like-minded individuals happens on social media. The proliferation of online propaganda and communications, more of which is increasingly encrypted, can pose unique challenges for us, especially over the last couple of years due to the demands of the pandemic, We see violent extremists are increasingly using social media and encrypted messaging applications for the distribution of propaganda, recruitment, target selection, and the incitement of violence. The widespread use of social media has increased the speed, dissemination, efficiency, and accessibility of both international and domestic violent extremist content, while also facilitating greater decentralized connectivity among extremist supporters. In other words, an extremist in one area of the world doesn't have to personally know an extremist in another area of the world to be inspired. There are fewer dots for investigators like us to be able to connect when individuals act alone and do not discuss their plans with others, or only do so behind encryption. That's why we often remind the American people of the important role they play in tipping off law enforcement intelligence before a violent incident occurs. And this is especially true of the youth and minors. People who are close to an individual are the most likely to notice a drastic change in someone that may indicate a radicalization or violent ideology, or a mobilization to take violent action. The FBI works hard to build its partnerships across our communities, with other government agencies, academia, the private sector, local and state law enforcement, and with mental health facilities, to bring together all available resources to help us better mitigate these terrorism threats. The big lesson from the study done by the 9/11 Commission is that no one agency can do the counterterrorism mission alone. We are building closer relationships and share more intelligence with our partners at every level, within the federal government, with our state and local authorities, and with our international allies. Our law enforcement and intelligence communities have broken down barriers and strengthened relationships both in the U.S. and abroad through our expanding memoranda of understanding and our mutual legal assistance treaties. The FBI and U.S. government deepened relationships with our international partners, and time again, when we've disrupted would-be terrorists within our borders, many of those cases were driven by intelligence shared by our most important partners. We continue to work closely with our counterparts in the U.S. intelligence community and our partners in like-minded countries to identify those responsible for lawless actions and take them out of the game. That may mean arresting and extraditing them to the United States to face justice, or it may mean prosecution by a foreign partner, or working with our intelligence community partners to find other ways to pressure and disrupt them, their infrastructure, and their money. It's why we're deployed across the world in more than 180 countries. As we all know, terrorism never happens in a vacuum. Attacks that occur overseas often become inspiration for would-be attackers at home. Every year, as I reflect on the tragic events of September 11th, my mind first goes to the magnitude of it. 2,977 victims, including the 414 first responders, lost their lives that day. Of the 2,977 victims, at least 372 people from 102 countries beside the United States died in the attack on that day, including 5 from Israel. The attack on our homeland was an attack on all of us. My next thought is always this: 9/11 isn't just something horrible that happened 21 years ago, but something terrible that is still happening to us. In its 2021 report, the Department of Justice 9/11 Victims Compensation Fund program assessed that more people are now believed to have died from 9/11 related illnesses than were lost on September 11th. Of the 100,000 Ground Zero responders and survivors enrolled in the World Trade Center Health Program, over 4,600 have already died. By some estimates, more than 400,000 people in Lower Manhattan, including those who lived, worked, and studied there, were exposed to toxic material from the collapse of the towers, leading to health issues that were diagnosed many years later. That terrible fact matches our FBI experience. Since 1925, there have been 88 service martyrs on the FBI's Wall of Honor. 21 of them are the result of 9/11, including one special agent who was killed in the collapse. The other 20 died as a result of exposure on that day as first responders to the toxic debris at each of the sites. We've lost 3 just this year. And to date, more than 100 FBI first responders are sick from exposure-related illnesses and disease. It's the memory of their bravery and ultimately their sacrifice that keeps me dedicated to this fight. As 21 years have passed since 9/11, the fight, and I mean fight, continues. How will our generation be remembered by the generation that follows? Will we be remembered as the generation that took the fight to our enemies, both foreign and domestic? Have we prepared the next generation to remember the atrocities committed by terrorists, to ensure they fight as hard as we fought? I, along with my colleagues, and many of you here today, have sought to ensure the answer to that last question is unequivocally yes. September 11th became the day we would never forget, and yet a new poll in the United States finds younger adults demonstrate less connection to 9/11 and the feelings of unity that Americans felt following the attack than their older counterparts. It's not enough to teach those who now have the responsibility to protect our countries how to do their job. We must show them and tell them why we do the job. We must ensure that those who do not remember that terrible day never forget why we do what we do. We must continue to take the fight to our enemies. We must stay focused on our mission to prevent terrorists from approaching our borders and our shorelines. We must continue to integrate our collective intelligence in everything we do, solidify our partnerships, perfect our information sharing. We must be relentless in our pursuit of justice to honor the victims of terrorism and those who fought and sacrificed like we have. We must never forget. Toda Rabah.